Hello everyone and welcome back to our lunchtime series of webinars delivered by staff in the Theology and Religious Department at the University of Chester in the UK. I'm Wendy Dussett and I'm delighted to be introducing this event. Our vision with these webinars is to support schools across the country and beyond at this difficult time by offering free talks on aspects of the A-Level RS curriculum. Each lecture is streamed live from our homes. We're grateful to the university's Learning Technology team for helping to make it possible. We think this series represents some of the special features of TRS Chester, our drive to use our expertise to support communities outside of the university and to make a difference, our passion for our subject, our commitment to supporting our in schools, our dedication to students and to making learning both relevant and fun. If you want to find out more about the kind of department we are and the degrees we offer, please visit our website. I really hope you love these lectures. Please do mention them on Twitter at TRS Chester using the hashtag A-Level-RS webinar. Now let me introduce our speaker for the 11th webinar in the series, Dr. Ben Fulford, who you might have met before. Ben is Senior Lecturer in Systematic Theology, and he's going to ask, can we deny God meaningfully? Ben's been with us in the department since 2012. He specialises in historical and contemporary Christian thought, including the topics of God and what it means to be human. And he's currently working on a book on the theology and social ethics of the American theologian Hans Frey. Ben, thank you for speaking to us on this topic on the A-Level curriculum. Religious language was the most requested topic when we asked students and teachers what topics they'd like us to cover. We'll hear from you for around 30 minutes and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. And just to reassure the audience, we at Chester can't see or hear you and neither can anyone else. To ask a written question in the chat, you just need to hover your mouse over the screen and click on the icon that looks like a speech bubble with a question mark in it. You should ask your questions anonymously. You can also upvote the questions you like, as well as asking your own, and I'll take that into account as I field them to Ben after his talk. So, Ben, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Wendy. Well, hello everyone. It's good to be here again, speaking to you from my study. And today, as Wendy said, our topic is, can we deny God meaningfully? And I'm hoping that's an interesting way into the subject of religious, and particularly theological language. So, first of all, a few clarifications and caveats about what I'm going to try to do in our short time together. I am not going to try and defeat atheism, so this isn't going to be some grand vanquishing of atheistic arguments or triumph of theistic arguments. That's not what I'm about here. I've got something a little bit more straightforward in mind. Also, a preview, I'm not going to try and deny that we can deny God meaningfully. So the question to my answer isn't going to be no. I think we can. I'm really interested in this question, this way of, I suppose, of interpreting the question, can we deny God meaningfully? That is, what does it take for key thinkers in the Christian tradition and their atheistic neighbours to disagree meaningfully about God? And so it's the meaning of the term God that's really key here. How can we get enough commonality, enough overlap on the substance of whatever that term means for Christian thinkers in order for other people to disagree with them and say, no, there is no God in that sense. And I'm doing so setting trivial differences aside. So sometimes you see people like Richard Dawkins, who I'll talk about in a moment, saying, well, obviously I don't, when believers deny that God is a man on fluffy clouds with a beard, I'm not interested in denying that God. I'm interested in denying something more substantial. So I'm not interested in sort of setting aside the question with something as glib as that. But really, how do we get on the same page in order to have a meaningful disagreement? Okay. I talked about having that disagreement between an atheist and thinkers in some key thinkers in the Christian tradition. And in particular, I'm thinking of a sort of a long strand of thinkers from the early Christian centuries through into the High Middle Ages, and then there's a long tradition of their interpretation and reception going on into the present day. Thinkers, so it's a strand that's exemplified by people like Irenaeus, you may have come across, the Cappadocian fathers like Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, Basil of Caesarea, really important in the development of the doctrine of the Trinity. Thinkers like someone who's called Pseudo-Dionysius, he pretended to be a character from the Acts of the Apostles, Dionysius the Areopagite. Augustine, you might have come across. Bonaventure, another important medieval thinker in the Franciscan tradition, or indeed Thomas Aquinas. And as I say, there are many people who commented and received and interpreted and reworked their ideas right up until today. You can think of them as sort of representing, in Alistair MacIntyre's way of thinking, an extended argument through time about how to talk about God and the meaning of God talk in the context of Christianity. So it's important to qualify there. Wendy talked about religious language, and that's true. I'm talking about religious language, but in the context of one particular religious tradition. And although there are overlaps between Christian God talk and God talk in some other traditions, not least are the Abrahamic traditions, as they're sometimes called, nevertheless, my focus is particularly on Christianity. And so I'm not trying to give a general or universal account here, and neither will, for the most part. Some of these thinkers may be trying to do that, some of them not, but probably their arguments work best when thought of in a particularly Christian context, with various degrees of sort of affinity and overlap with other traditions. I'm going to call this tradition, within the Christian tradition, the apophatic cataphatic tradition. Now you might say, well, that's typical academics, inventing words to make things sound more complicated, but I think it's helpful because it names something particular about these thinkers that I want to try and express through the rest of this talk. So let me unpack some of those terms. Apophatic. Apophatic is from Greek term sort of meaning away from speech. And in its technical language, its technical meaning in Christian theology is talking about what God is not. Negative talk of God, denying things about God. So it might just interest you to know that denying things about God is a central part of this tradition. It's a core part of their theological practice, saying what God is not. And then cataphatic. Cataphatic is the opposite. It's saying what God is, affirming things of God. Speaking in respect of God would be a way of unpacking, again, the Greek origins of that term. Apophatic, cataphatic, by putting those two words together, I want to say this is a tradition of thinkers who think we can say things meaningfully about God, but it's much clearer what we don't mean than what we do. So they agree we can say things about God, and therefore it must be possible to deny things of God as well altogether. But it's much clearer when we say things of God what we don't mean by them than what we do, and you find they spend a lot of their time doing more negating than affirming, and being much clearer about the negations and the content of the affirmations. So that's, if you like, a preview of where we're headed. Where should we start? Well, I'm not sure I'm not the first person to do this. In fact, I know I'm not, but I'm going to start with Richard Dawkins. I should also say, actually, in passing, that the inspiration for taking this approach, by way of the possibility, the question of can we deny God meaningfully, is partly inspired by a now rather famous lecture by a theologian called Dennis Turner. His inaugural lecture as a professor in Cambridge was entitled "How to Be an Atheist," and his argument is about the work that needs to be done in order to deny the kind of God that someone like Aquinas talked about exists. And my argument is going to be of a similar kind of argument to that. And I think Dawkins is in the background of Turner's piece, his lecture, and I think Dawkins is a helpful way to frame this because he illustrates, I think, a kind of relatively easy denial of God that I want to try and complicate. So there he is, Richard Dawkins, in his famous book, The God Delusion. It's also significant, I suppose, because Dawkins not only illustrates, I think, a rather easy denial of God, but a very popular and widely received one as well. So when Dawkins denies that there is a God, and he wants to deny that there is any God, in any non-trivial sense. What does he mean? Well, he talks about denying a superhuman, supernatural intelligence who deliberately designed and created the universe and everything in it, including us. He says that very clearly. That's what he means by the God hypothesis that he thinks he's going to offer an argument against. And he takes it that when he says that, he's ruling out any substantive belief in God. And that includes for him belief in a personal God, as in the Abrahamic traditions, as existing inside or indeed outside the universe, although he's not quite sure what the latter part of that might mean. And especially he's focusing on the notion of God as the intelligent designer responsible for the cosmos. And it's really the argument from intelligent design that Dawkins is most concerned to deny, and thereby to deny the existence of God. For him, other arguments for God's existence are more or less outdated. What interests me here is that all the terms in the way that Dawkins describes the God whom he wants to deny, he can use them in a very straightforward way without a great deal of qualification. The prefix super does quite a lot of work here, though it's not very clear what work it does. But apart from the word super, there's not a great deal to distinguish the language that Dawkins uses of God and the language that he or others might use of anything else in the world. And indeed, God appears in Dawkins more or less as another thing in the world, only bigger. So all the terms have very straightforward meanings, only sometimes they get somewhat inflated with the word super. And super seems to sort of intensify, but not do much more to the meaning. So you can sort of imagine that the meaning of superhuman, supernatural, of intelligence, of deliberately, of design, of created, all those terms applied to God seem to exist in a common space, as it were, with the way that they're used in other contexts. If there's a sense of intensification, then they belong in the same scale as they do for other uses of those terms. So it's relatively easy to know what we mean by God and relatively easy to deny God, and to, as Dawkins does, posit God as a rather poor explanation for the emergence of an extremely complex cosmos, in particular a cosmic, a complex biological world that he has particular expertise in. I'm not going to take issue with Dawkins on natural selection, evolution by natural selection as a good explanation for the complexity of the biological world. I'm really interested in the way that he describes God, and as I say, the apparent ease with which he feels he can do that and thereby capture everything that Christians, amongst many others, mean by that term. And it's the ease with which Dawkins describes God that I think would strike thinkers in the tradition I've talked about, the apophatic, cataphatic tradition. I think it's the ease that they'd find odd and that they'd probably focus on. Okay, now I'm going to bring in Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, originally from Austria and ended up settling and working in Cambridge. A lot of his work through the 20s and 30s, 40s, and into the 50s before his death. Wittgenstein is not normally thought of as a theologian, although he is quite influential on quite a number of recent theologians. He would think of himself as more of a philosopher, but he's really useful here because of the way he thinks about religious language, and hence he finds his way onto A-level syllabi and onto university courses too in theology, as well as philosophy of religion. And we tend to distinguish different phases in Wittgenstein's thought, an early and a later phase. And I'm going to focus mainly on the later Wittgenstein, as he's sometimes called, the philosophy that he developed partly in reaction to his own earlier philosophy, and that's exemplified by one of the few works he actually published in his lifetime, in his later period, possibly the only work, if I remember rightly, the Philosophical Investigations, which is a really fascinating text. If you've ever learned a musical instrument and you've had to practice exercises, not only scales but other ways of practicing your instrument so that you really get it under your fingers, or however it is that you play your instrument, that you learn to refine and develop your skills as a musician. Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations are a little bit like that. They're exercises in trying to relieve philosophers, especially, including himself, I think, of some of their illusions about their discipline, some of their basic mistakes about the way they conceive of philosophical problems and go about trying to resolve them. Now, I'm not going to get into, there's another caveat, all the various interpretations of Wittgenstein on religious language, and there are many, and he's highly contested. So there are people who think that Wittgenstein offers us an account of religious language that is non-cognitive, that says that religious language doesn't have a sort of propositional content. It's about something else. It's about attitudes, perhaps, or dispositions in a practical context. Or others who are labelled sometimes as Wittgensteinian fideists, who think that religious language is just doing something wholly different from other kinds of activity, such as scientific or certain kinds of philosophical claim, and that there's really no conversation to be had between them. I'm not sure if there are really any real Wittgensteinian fideists, but in case there are, I'm not going to focus on that either. And then there are people who say actually Wittgenstein isn't concerned to rule out the idea that language really relates to the world. He's trying to deal with some more naive versions of what we call realism. And that's I think quite a plausible claim, but my focus is really on the usefulness of his approach to language when it comes to religious language in general, but especially to Christian uses. Again, Wittgenstein tends to sort of assume a more or less Christian focus in the background, but it's not particularly clear about that, and I want to be a little bit clearer for the most part. So, as I say, he's trying to, I think, help philosophers, including himself, get over some of the problems they get tangled up in. And he thinks those problems come from not paying close enough attention to the key terms they use in their arguments, terms which arise from everyday, ordinary language, which philosophers have, as he thinks, sort of honed in on and said, there's something really strange going on there. There's a philosophical problem and we need to solve it. So problems around terms like meaning or understanding, for example. At root here, he thinks, is a faulty way of thinking about the way that language works, that's overly focused, particularly on relationships of names to things, in abstraction from the ways in which those names, those terms function in ordinary language. And obviously a lot of ordinary language doesn't fit into the paradigm of naming, which is one of the points that he likes to make. And his overall approach, which he repeatedly sort of describes at various points in this sort of very aphoristic sort of text, it's numbered in paragraphs, and there's a constant sort of dialogue between himself and other versions of himself, or perhaps his people he teaches, or other unnamed interlocutors. In that dialogical, sort of pedagogical interaction, it's a sort of almost Socratic exchange. It's a really gentle way of actually presenting philosophical arguments, but you have to get used to it. Anyway, in that, he repeatedly comes back to describe what he thinks he's doing. And that's the idea that if we attend more closely to what we're doing when we use particular terms in our language, in their ordinary uses, we'll see that there isn't a sort of essence to that term lying behind it, perhaps in some strange way located in the mind, and that we have to get into that essence of that term and what lies behind it in order to resolve a philosophical problem. Rather, terms have meanings in the different ways in which they're used in various different practical contexts, what he sometimes calls or likens to language games. And if we pay close enough attention to those uses, we'll find that a lot of the problems we think we have as philosophers aren't really problems at all. A lot of them will go away. And that attention to the ways in which language is used in particular practical contexts is what Wittgenstein sometimes calls grammar, or making grammatical remarks or observations. The approach, I think, which can be quite helpful as a way in to thinking about religious language and particularly theological language in Christian tradition. Wittgenstein does have some things to say about religious statements. He wanted to trouble the idea that they're primarily to be thought of as descriptive, propositions of apparent facts in just the same way as they might be in historical arguments or scientific claims. He thinks they have a different relationship to questions of evidence, ones that don't fit in those sort of paradigms. They have different practical consequences too for the kinds of things people do in relation to them, the way they live their lives. They're connected with different kinds of experience from historical or scientific arguments, and they're bound up with different kinds of life commitment. So there's a difference there, which he's quite good at repeatedly sort of going through in a way in his lectures on religion. But he's less clear on really what is going on, more clear on the difference than on a clear sense of how religious language is working. Nevertheless, as I say, this approach to grammar, to describing the ways in which language is used, is quite helpful. And there's a number of theologians from the mid-20th century onwards who've taken that as a good clue into thinking about this tradition I'm talking about, the apophatic cataphatic tradition, and some of its major thinkers, often especially Thomas Aquinas. So they're sometimes known as Wittgensteinian Thomists. So there's one to get your tongue around. Herbert McCabe is one example, David Burrell another. There are several others besides. You can think about thinkers in the tradition I'm concerned about as commenting on the grammar of Christian God talk, how it is that Christians are using the term God in their language and in the context of the ways in which they live their Christian lives. But they're not just doing so descriptively as Wittgenstein was concerned to do, they're also doing critically. There's a sense in which there is a sort of a normative way of practicing God talk and embodying it in one's life. A way that is normed perhaps to some degree by certain ways of using scriptural language in the context of Christian worship and of Christian practice, where there are certain sort of structures to that, and which are exemplified by certain exemplary sort of believers that we call saints. And they want to make that a sort of norm against which to measure actual Christian God talk. So there's a sense here in which Christian believers on the ground, many of them will exemplify Christian God talk, and many of them, and this without any, I think, correlation with questions of intellectual capacity, many of them will, to varying degrees, depart from that exemplary way of speaking of God and embodying God talk. And they want to, basically, their theology is about a way of helping us practice God talk more faithfully. That's the goal. So I need to get a move on, but let's think about God talk in this tradition. When thinkers in this tradition talk about God and talking about God, when they talk about the grammar of God talk, they have in mind, I think, quite a rich and complex culture, if you like. So they're thinking in part of an experience of being caught up in a transformative encounter with, this is one way of parsing the grammar of God, with one who is beyond and yet at the root of everything. One who is beyond and yet at the root of everything, and yet is being encountered in a distinctive threefold manner that has to do with God as being creator, God as being one who is incarnate in Jesus Christ, present, and one who is within Christian communities and individual believers as the Spirit. And that experience is interpreted through concepts. Again, this is a very sort of post-Wittgensteinian way of putting it, but I think it's also helpful. An experience interpreted through concepts drawn from the interpretation of scriptures inherited from Jewish tradition and also what became the New Testament, also shaped by Christian practices of worship, what we call liturgy, and other Christian practices too. So that experience interpreted through those concepts, and it yields a sort of rich, complex practice of talking of God within a form of life understood as being on the way back to God, of pilgrimage toward God, return to God, a return that is by way of Jesus Christ as its sort of path and paradigm, its pattern, and that is empowered by the presence of the Holy Spirit. A way of life that's enfolded into the very life of God through the Spirit, through sharing in the life of Christ. So God talk, as it were, happens within the context of a relationship with God, an incorporation into the life of God. So there's a sort of bound upness of Christian God talk with an existential reality and the practices that sort of facilitate and assist and shape it. And in that way of thinking, in this tradition, contemplative prayer and attention to the reality of God, a reality that is beyond conceptualization, is really central. And it's bound up with other disciplines too that are about liberating human beings from the grip of sort of distorting habits of life, of sins which turn them away from God and their neighbour, and practices which help them refocus upon God and attend lovingly to their neighbour. Practices that often go under the label of ascesis, which basically means practices. So God talk takes place in that context, that rich sort of culture. Okay, a bit more about it. When these thinkers try to attend to the grammar of this complex way of talking of God within this practical and existential situation, they tend to think that basic to that grammar, that those uses of God, is a radical, that is, goes to the root, a radical distinction between God and everything else, thought of as creation. A radical distinction between God and creation, and a connection between them. And this may be familiar if you were at my last talk. This grammar is quite key to the way in which thinkers in this tradition think about impassibility as well. That grammar is based in a sort of a core sensibility that they find in Christian worship and Christian practice, a sense of the utter contingency, the non-necessity that it could have not been of oneself, others, and the whole cosmos of which one is a part. All of that hangs upon something beyond it, a sense of contingency which is repeated in the experience of salvation as well. Salvation is, if you like, as recreation. And that's the sense they find of an utter difference that God makes to everything. So one way of getting at the grammar of God talk is to ask, what's the difference that God makes? And for thinkers in this tradition, that difference is everything, the difference between everything in all its complexity and richness, and oneself as part of it, and nothing whatsoever. And it hangs off that sense of the utter contingency of it all. So one thinker who exemplifies, I think, this way of parsing, of reading the grammar of Christian God talk is Thomas Aquinas. I'm sure you're probably familiar with him if you're doing RS A level or philosophy of religion. We tend to think of Thomas Aquinas as a philosopher sometimes, which he is, but he's also a Christian theologian too. And in fact, the two are quite closely related in his thought. We tend to focus on his ways of apparently proving the existence of God. But they form a really small part of his writings, even in the larger text from which they come, the Summa Theologiae, a text which is really a textbook for people training to be priests. It's just one article in one question of one part of a humongous corporate work. And it does, he sort of gets through his proofs for the existence of God in pretty short order. They're basically quite short summaries. I think he means them as proofs because that's what he calls them, but their function in the context of the Summa, of the large text of which they're a part, is really as a shorthand for the grammar of what we ordinarily mean by God, or what people did in his context and culture. And one way of summing up the force of each of the 5 ways is that they all gesture towards one on whom everything else is entirely contingent, but who is not in turn contingent on anything else in any way. They gesture to one on whom all else is entirely contingent, but who is not contingent on anything else in any way. And what Aquinas does in the subsequent questions of the first part of the Summa is begin to unfold that grammar, its implications, and what it means for other aspects of Christian God talk. So God here names that which makes the difference between nothing and, as I say, the rich and complex cosmos of which we are a part. That cosmos actually existing. That is the existing cosmos in all its reality and nothing whatsoever. A difference which is actually quite hard to imagine or conceptualize. And God, in this way of talking, names one for whom that difference between everything and nothing is not a difference for God. Whatever it is that's responsible for that difference is not, as it were, subject to it, is not marked by it. And therefore, God is one, whatever God is one for whom reality, existence, actuality is not an added extra. It's not something that is added to whatever God is. Rather, whatever God is to be actual. And so Aquinas talks about God being to be, the Latin is esse, or being pure act. There is no distinction in God between what God is and that God is. God is pure, unconditioned actuality. You might say, what on earth does that mean? And Thomas Aquinas will probably go, exactly. To say that God is pure act is, its force is negative. It's saying what God is not. There is no difference between what God is and that God is. Or, as he says it, God is not composed of essence, what God is, and existence, that God is. And that's what Thomas means by simplicity. God is not composed of parts. And the parts he has in mind, we parse it different ways, but the most important one perhaps is that one, essence and existence. And that means that God for Aquinas, and God as he thinks Christians mean it, names a difference beyond every category available to us. Because, as Dennis Turner puts it quite nicely in some of his works, all the language that we have pertains to things within the cosmos. It helps us categorize them, amongst other things. Helps them put them in boxes which belong to larger boxes, which belong to yet larger boxes, which fit into schemas which in turn be related to each other, and so on and so forth. And even the most difficult to understand differences can somehow be fitted into a larger category that encompasses them both. And so you can think of differences from very close things, within species, within so different kinds of sheep, between sheep and other animals and so forth, building up into differences between animals and, I don't know, the planet Jupiter, between the planet Jupiter and something in a very different kind of category like a colour. And yet God doesn't belong to any of those ways of categorization, but is beyond them all. Okay, I'm getting tight for time, so I'm going to move along a bit. Aquinas then, there's a question of, is there any positive meaning to God talk, or is it all negative? And in part, Aquinas is responding to a Jewish philosopher, Humanities, who thought the answer to that is no. God and creatures are so unlike each other, and God is independent as creatures are dependent, that there are no attributes which meaningfully, positive attributes which meaningfully apply to God. God has no parts, therefore no essential attributes. God is independent and therefore has no relative attributes. Divine attributes are really about the ways we perceive and feel about God's action, and that's really where they have their meaning. There is positive meaning because of the relationship between God and creatures. If God is the first cause of creatures, all that is good about them, all their perfections, ultimately derive from God. They have their source there. They pre-exist in God in some more excellent way, and he's deliberately vague, I think, when he says that. There is therefore a relationship, a resemblance between cause and effects. That's a general principle. In some cases, that resemblance is quite close. So when human beings have babies, there's a close resemblance between parents and children. Sometimes there's a resemblance which he calls a genus resemblance, such as between sunlight and the sun, or the heat of the sun and the sun. The likeness between God and creatures is outside those kinds of categorizable likeness. It's in virtue of their relationship between their existing and the actuality of God that brings them into existence, which is an uncategorizable likeness for Aquinas. So there's a real likeness, but one that is very difficult, really impossible to get a full handle on. And so he says that there's some sort of likeness or analogy, and a likeness within much greater unlikeness. And talk of God comes from that connection, that likeness amidst greater unlikeness, from the effects of God in creatures. And names for God signify the reality of God by way of that connection, that likeness, imperfectly, diversely from the diversity of creatures and their limited likeness to God. And therefore they don't name God as God really is. Some of them name God improperly from things very unlike God, metaphors. Some name God properly, but through that relationship, that causes a relationship, and therefore in a way that embodies a great deal of dissimilarity, much more than the similarity. So that they're proper to God, but the way that they signify God is a creaturely one and therefore improper. And therefore we don't really fully know what it is we mean when we use them of God. They apply superlatively to God, but we have to do a lot of denying. And that denying leaves us really with a sense of mystery, really, at the end of it. There's a strange grammar to God talk on this account. We can talk of God, but it's clear what we don't mean and what we do. We talk about God's knowledge, for example. Knowledge must apply to God as a creaturely perfection, pre-existing God in some more excellent way, but in accordance with a very different way in which God exists compared to creatures, independently, without parts, eternally, as pure act. And so Aquinas will say God knows everything by way of God's knowledge of God's self, and simultaneously, and not as a succession of thoughts or a conclusion drawn from premises. So here Dawkins' sort of talk of supernatural and superhuman doesn't really do justice to this way of thinking, and his thinking of God as a designer as well also fits rather poorly. A brief postscript to this. This way of thinking has been developed in subsequent centuries, and one recent development is the feminist theologian Elizabeth Johnson. Dawkins writes off the idea of God as an old man, perhaps rather too quickly. It's an image which has done a great deal of work in Christian contexts and cultures to legitimate the power of old men, especially old white men, and that's the God you often see depicted in an awful lot of Christian iconography. Johnson's question is, can God talk be rescued from that kind of idolatry, that confusion of God with the power of old white men? And it's mainly the male part of that that she's interested in, although she acknowledges the problem of race as well. Her work is to say, well, actually the characteristic experiences of women can also be a site for analogical naming of God. We shouldn't assume man as the default. And in this way, you can both be coherent with Aquinas' way of thinking and correct his sort of patriarchal assumptions about masculinity and the normativeness of masculinity. He was completely wrong about that. And this is typical of a sort of liberative way of which some theologians talk about a correct God talk, exposing the way it justifies oppressive forms of human power. And so Johnson here is both continuous with Aquinas' concern for the distinction between God and creatures, but also for exposing the way in which poor forms of God talk, even ones deeply rooted in the tradition, can have oppressive functions, and for finding liberative alternatives. And I'll perhaps go a bit more into detail on that in the questions. And she reminds us really that this project, if you like, is a developing, unfolding one, a critical project to which she's a contributor. Denying God is quite possible in relation to this project, this tradition, but for that denial to have real purchase, you need to get into the complexity I've just begun to hint at, and in its contested nature. And indeed, you need to take account of sort of projects like Johnson's, who want to deny certain things about God and affirm others as well. It's often easier, even in Johnson as well, although perhaps it could be harder still in her account too, often easier to say in this tradition what God is not than what God is. And so, in a sense, we could say, if you really want to be an atheist in respect of Christian God talk, at least as represented by this tradition, you need to study theology and religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Great way to end there. Thanks for that. Some questions coming through, kind of reaching back to the beginning of your talk and Dawkins' definition of God. And somebody's asked here, is Dawkins' definition just too simple then? And is the problem that he's denying what is a popular but simplistic view of God? So in other words, his denial doesn't work because we can challenge what he means by God.
Yeah, that's exactly the argument I want to make, really. I mean, I think there are some people who espouse Christian faith and do talk about God in these terms. I think there are particular forms of Christianity, perhaps, that Dawkins has more purchase on than others. But I suppose what I wish he would do is have looked a bit more deeply into the Christian tradition, which is not, and to representatives of it who, although sophisticated, which is a term, it tends to be a term of abuse in Dawkins, nevertheless, do I think represent something of the grammar of God talk that many Christians at an ordinary level, in various ways, do illustrate and exemplify.
Got another Dawkins question just come in actually. So I'm going to read it in its entirety. Dawkins states in his latest book Outgrowing God and several interviews that he doesn't study the Bible or religious theology, but instead does science and concerns himself with what he believes is true. In another interview, he gives an alternative to God, which is some sort of superintelligent life, brackets aliens. Before trying to form a denial of God's existence, shouldn't we focus on getting an accurate definition from the Bible or whatever religion that the God we want to deny is from?
Good question. Yeah, so I think what I like about that question, or what I want to affirm there, is the sense that in order to have a meaningful argument about God, first of all, you need to get a sense of what you mean by the term. And if you want to disagree with someone from a particular religious tradition, you need to figure out what it is that that term means in their tradition. And that's a complex thing which requires quite a lot of study and thought and analysis. And I suppose if you're not really willing to do that, then you limit the possibilities of how much denying God you can really do. I mean, the Bible does form part of the background for Dawkins' denial of God, and he does like to quote particularly some of the more lurid and certainly to our minds offensive parts of biblical portrayals of God, and he's right to raise those. I don't think you can simply read Christian grammars of God simply straight from the Bible, insofar as you have to take account of the ways in which Christians use biblical texts. So that notion of Wittgenstein of grammar, of paying attention to use, that applies also to the use of scriptural texts too. So there's a bit more, another layer of complexity to it, if you like.
That links nicely to another question about, where does this idea about God come from then? It's not just the Bible, and somebody has raised the context of worshipping and connecting with God. So the question is put like this: in the apophatic cataphatic tradition, it seems like you can only really discuss God in the context of worshipping and connecting with him. That seemed to be quite a strong theme in your talk. So is it possible for an atheist to discuss God in the style of this tradition? I guess where can an atheist then join the conversation about God if the only real place that a conversation can take place is in that worshipping tradition?
That's a really good question, and that speaks to some of the debates around the interpretation of Wittgenstein, in fact. So that's really helpful. Can there really be a conversation between someone within a religious form of life and their uses of the term God, and someone who is outside that use, that form of life? Obviously, some atheists, as it were, do come from religious forms of life, and that often shapes their atheisms in particular ways. I think so. The really strong version of that position that says there can't be a conversation is sometimes called incommensurability. These are just diverse ways of thinking. But then it becomes difficult to describe any difference at all or disagreement. And yet people do seem to end up having meaningful arguments. And I think what I would hold out for is the possibility that, yes, it's true. I suppose I am saying that the meanings of God talk in a religious tradition take a particular shape from the ways that term is used in the context of practices like worship. I think I do want to say that. But one can observe and comment on the grammar of those practices, whether or not one is a participant. I think it depends on being able to be a really good participant observer, if you like. So when you mentioned Hans Frey earlier, and this is the way he thinks about, I think, the ways in between people who speak from within a religious tradition and people who want to speak about it from, as it were, without. And one could trouble that inside-outside boundary, but he likes to draw on the work of Clifford Geertz, who was influenced by Wittgenstein, and the notion that you can sort of, without becoming a member of a particular community, nevertheless, you can immerse yourself in it sufficiently that you become fluent, if you like, in its uses of language, in its various forms and rituals and characteristic activities. And so in that sort of ethnographic attention to forms of life and uses of language and practice, there's a sort of bridge between the insider and the outsider, if you like. Does that help?
Yes. You mentioned Wittgenstein at the beginning of that, and somebody here has asked, would Wittgenstein think that it is reasonable for someone who does not have a personal belief in God themselves to be able to have a meaningful conversation about God?
That's a really good question. When it's asked of Wittgenstein, I'm not sure. So if you read his lectures on religion, they come in, they're published in this book. So with other various other lectures, he didn't sort of polish them up for publication. They were published posthumously. They're published from notes from his students. So we have to sort of bear those things in mind as well. But they do sort of resemble the way he presents himself in the philosophical investigations. He's really puzzled by religious language. I think he's much clearer about what it isn't doing, that it's not like this or that, than what really is going on. You can see there's connections to form of life and so on, to existential commitments and dispositions. And so it's as though he's sort of edging around being able to have a conversation, but he's not quite knowing where to start with it. So I'm not sure he has an answer to that question himself.
Interesting. That was a very popular question. People obviously very interested in Wittgenstein's view. Lovely question here, and it will have to be our final one, I'm afraid. But how might other forms of communication, e.g., music, art, gesture, affirm or deny God, especially regarding the mysterious and ineffable nature of God?
That's a fantastic question. Yeah.
Maybe words and philosophical concepts are just a complete red herring.
Yes, maybe. I do want to say that words in their relative uselessness are in this way of understanding anyway, can gesture towards something that's utterly mysterious, and can function as sort of guides to practice and to contemplation. But I don't think words are necessarily privileged in having that function. So I think you can argue that forms of, let's just say very broadly, other forms of cultural practice, not only sort of more elite forms of art or music, but popular ones as well, can have that sort of gesturing function, can exhibit a similar grammar that gestures towards this properly unnameable reality that encompasses the users. And yeah, I think one can probably think of examples of religious art, both of various kinds, that does that. Having said, not only those are the ones that spring into my mind, but I think you could argue that. So I think perhaps one could analyse Stormzy's Glastonbury set in some respects as perhaps trying to do that. The various forms of, say, I don't know, the music of Arvid Pärt, for example, or Oliver Messiaen, I think is trying to do something similar as well. And the comparison is really nice because it helps us, as I say, deprivilege the linguistic and certain forms of cognition, and see that actual sort of mystical encounter, I suppose, that those forms of language are meant to facilitate, is available in many other ways and is not the purview of academic theologians or particularly exceptional people or particularly brainy people. I think understood at its deepest insights, this tradition is, and some people made this kind of argument, is quite consistent with not seeing any correlation necessarily to cognitive capacity.
Ben, we are going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much. Sorry to everybody whose questions that we didn't get to, but I will be doing a follow-up interview with Ben at some point, probably later this week. So we'll upload that to the page on our departmental website. I'm just putting a feedback link in our chat so that you can give us some feedback on this session. We'd be grateful for that. And in the meantime, we hope that you'll join us this time next week for what is sadly the final webinar in this series. Happily, though, it's a good one. Our senior lecturer in religion and popular culture, Dr. Steve Knowles, will be speaking on the arguments for the existence of God. Thanks, everybody, for being with us today, and hopefully see you next week. And thank you very much, Ben.
Thanks.